Tell me a little bit about Jose Antonio. What was his political vision? Because it really is a political vision. He died before he could fully come into his own. He died young. I mean, no, he didn't even get to fully develop.
Of course, exactly.
Ideologically, he had reached the point where he could say, these are my foundations.
Of course. And we need to clarify something. He dies because he is murdered. Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera is one of the most of cancer. He is one of the martyrs who, for various reasons, will never be recognized under the historical memory law or the democratic memory law. Well, the first thing we need to talk about is the figure of Jose Antonio. Jose Antonio, as I always say, was an intellectual. He was a guy who traded weapons for words, for debate, for dialogue. He was a guy who managed to make everyone who met him, regardless of their political ideology, recognize his humanity above anything else. We can see this in all kinds of testimonies. He was very good friends with Lorca, with Federico Garcia Lorca. He had a personal relationship, and in fact, the person he didn't have a good personal relationship with was Franco. Look, there's an anecdote. The link that connected Franco with Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera was Serrano Suñer. Serrano Suñer was a classmate of Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera in law school, when Jose Antonio studied law, and he was also Franco's brother-in-law. So Serrano Suñer, once before, obviously before the outbreak of the Civil War, brought together Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera and Franco at his house. It is the only documented occasion we have of Jose Antonio and Franco meeting in person. In that meeting, Jose Antonio says he was shocked because he didn't see Franco as someone who had a very clear vision for the state, someone who wanted to build a nation around shared ideals, but rather he saw him as just a military man. Yes, but militarily, I mean, he was unbeatable. Franco was feared in all the armies of the world because all the promotions he got in the army were based on merit, not just on career progression. That's something unheard of. He was a feared military man, but Jose Antonio had more doubts about his abilities as a statesman. It's often said, Jose Antonio remarked, "My father was also a dictator, but at least he was a nice guy." So, he was someone who at least rejected the kind of country Franco wanted to build because he did not see a clear vision for the country in Franco. He was, on the other hand, an intellectual. He was a guy who studied law, who set up his own law firm, who was also a member of parliament for a very brief period in the Cortes, and who had an oratory skill that, for me, has been unmatched. I've never seen in Spain a politician, neither before nor after probably, with an oratory skill similar to the one he had. Above all, what interests me most about him is his humanity. We can discuss his work later if you want. To recognize the other person's humanity, that there was another person there, even if you differed ideologically, right? That's what I think is completely being lost nowadays. Nowadays, we are dehumanizing. You explained it very well in the debate. You said, hey, we live in a time where we are dehumanizing people who come here to breathe, to debate. And as soon as we see that someone is from the left, without even stopping to listen to what they defend, how they have to defend it, we are directly questioning them instead of questioning their ideas. That is the absolute result of dehumanization. And it's something that everyone agrees is contrary to the way Jose Antonio conceived of people. So regarding him and his work, he didn't actually get to develop it because he was indeed killed in the Alicante prison. But for me, there is an essential trilemma that perfectly defines the idea behind Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, which is homeland, bread, and justice. We can play around to see how relevant and necessary this trilemma is today, to see what would happen in a society if we remove one of these three pillars, right? We can think of a society where there is a certain sense of nation, of homeland, where there is bread, meaning there are raw materials, but there is no justice. That could lead us back to what was once Venezuela's narco-dictatorship. I don't deny that in Venezuela people were very patriotic. I don't deny that there were raw materials and even resources within Venezuela, but the problem was that there was no justice. Justice that would redistribute because the vast majority of the raw materials are accumulated by a tiny minority of the population, a tyrannical class of Nicolas Maduro's regime, right? That's what happens if we remove the leg of justice. If there is no justice, if we have a society without justice, what happens is that no matter how much bread there is or how much national or patriotic feeling there is, the nation completely falls apart, it limps. A nation where there is a sense of homeland and a sense of justice, but there is no bread, would be a metaphysical impossibility. A nation without raw materials to prosper is likely to become a satellite state of another nation that supplies them in exchange for its sovereignty, right? And what happens in a nation where there is bread and there is justice, but there is no idea of homeland? Something similar to what's happening in Western societies would occur. Western societies attack that idea of identity through those supranational organizations like the European Union or the United Nations. That's why they want us to believe identity is just territory, population, government, and capacity. So we don't realize there's something unique that makes Spaniards different from the French from the Germans, and the Germans from the Italians. Is there an identity? And what the European Union is doing is almost turning nations into giant supermarkets, huge supermarkets that, yes, trade freely, of transmission of goods, services, capital, and people across the European Economic Area through this open borders policy. Well, I don't deny that we can trade among ourselves, but when we undermine and attack what makes us Spain and what makes France be France, we are attacking the homeland of the nation. And look where this comes from. It comes from a trilemma that José Antonio formulated about 90 years ago. I would bring back the trilemma of homeland, bread, and justice.
How could it be brought back? I don't think there are any in Spain.
The only thing there is bread. Well, of course, exactly, right? Let's see. Yes, justice in Spain works as it does, and there's debate about whether slow justice is true justice. I don't think so. Justice must act when needed. How would it be restored? Well, of course, if you ask me, I'm going to approach it from my own perspective through technocracy, where what you do is first have a moral framework behind it, a moral framework. And let me be clear, for people who find this very dangerous, there are people who will say, this is very totalitarian, this is very tyrannical, this is dictatorial. Well, let's see. Morality is always the same, or it stays more or less unchanging no matter how much the majority decides otherwise, because of what we said before, right? Even if cannibals became the majority in Spain, that wouldn't let them change the established moral belief that cannibalism goes against what our society wants. There must be a guiding idea behind that technocracy, which should first restore Spain's sovereignty. Spain needs to regain its sovereignty. Spain must once again separate from supranational organizations that erode its identity and sovereignty by constantly transferring powers to bodies like the European Union, United Nations, NATO, and the OECD, which is more economic than political. We need to reclaim our sovereignty. After regaining sovereignty, we must carry out a process of refoundation. When everything has failed us, when democracy fails us because it promises us freedom, and what it brings is slavery and submission to the 78 regime, when politicians fail us, who supposedly propose to row in the same direction and end up creating more polarization than there was before, when the free market fails us, which promises us prosperity and brings us debt, the only thing left for us is to start from scratch. Start from scratch again. Start with our people, which is the only thing we have in common. The only thing that unites Spaniards is that we are Spaniards, that we share a common past. If we forget that common past, or silence it, or tarnish it, or cover it up, or hide it, what we're doing is creating a society where absolutely nothing unites us. I support a sovereign society. This refoundation process, which some may see as very communist, must begin at the grassroots. It has to start from the bottom. Because of what I said, because those at the top have failed us. And when those at the top fail us, all we have left are those of us who have always been here. It's this idea that only the people save the people. We've seen it in Havana, we've seen it in La Palma, we've seen it in Adamus, just yesterday. We saw it in the March 11th attacks in 2004. Only the people save the people. If we want this to be the case, the people have to be united. To unite, we must acknowledge the problem. To solve that problem, I repeat, my solution is a process of refoundation, one that starts completely from scratch and always keeps in mind the recovery of the nation's sovereignty.